Hi everyone, this is Kirsty again. I wanted to talk a little bit about the checking compulsion, but not checking as people who are uneducated about OCD would consider checking. I want to talk about the internal checking, so the mental compulsion of checking whether the thoughts are there, checking whether the feelings and the urges are there and how you're feeling in that moment. And I think this one is important to talk about because it comes into play with several of the OCD themes. For example, with our OCD, when you're around your partner, are you checking your feelings, or whether you're turned on, whether the thoughts are there, whether you have an urge to leave? With POCD, for example, again, checking in with yourself whether the desire's there, whether you're having the physical symptoms, the responses. And then with harm OCD, for example, if you're like checking if you've got the urges and if you're feeling the impulses to act on your thoughts, and checking if you're feeling angry, for example. And again, any of the themes surrounding identity, if you're feeling like yourself, or if you're having the transgender theme, checking if you have the feelings or feeling like a man or a woman. Or if it's a theme surrounding sexuality, checking your arousal levels around the sex that you feel like you shouldn't be attracted to, the sex that you don't identify with being attracted to. And if you're having OCD themes surrounding having other mental health conditions outside of OCD, it might be checking, for example, if you are stuck on the theme of psychosis, checking if you're having any symptoms of psychosis. Or it might be if you're stuck on the thought of having bipolar, you might be checking, do I feel depressed, or do I feel particularly manic? Or if, as I've discussed in another video, your OCD may perhaps have latched onto your recovery, you may start to have the urge to constantly check how you're feeling, if you're feeling good on that day or if you're feeling down, and checking on constantly how well you're doing in your recovery, and how bad your OCD has been on that particular day. And the problem with this is that it is a constant internal focus. OCD already has you internally focused anyway on the thoughts that you've been having. But if you're constantly monitoring whether they're still there, and you're focused and you're thinking about it and testing yourself perhaps, or perhaps you're playing scenarios in your head to see what kind of response you get, to see if you feel like you like the scenario in your head or the image, and if you have a physical response, a groinal response, for example. You might be checking if you still have an anxiety response to it, and panicking if you don't have an anxiety response to it, and then continuously replaying it to see if you can get the anxiety response, because it offers almost a bit of reassurance that it is OCD. But again, the testing for anxiety comes in with the idea of the backdoor spike again. So as your anxiety starts to come down a little bit as you work through recovery, you get concerned then that means something. So when you're testing for the anxiety, you may be less likely to feel it. So Rob talks about this in a couple of ways that I found particularly useful, because this was a problem that I found myself suffering with a lot. The constant awareness of my internal state, constant monitoring of my moods, my feelings, how I feel about the thoughts, how anxious I feel. If I feel particularly anxious on that day, why am I feeling anxious? Or if I'm not anxious, why am I not feeling anxious? And Rob said, you walk around with a giant thermometer in your brain. And this was a really good way of thinking about it, noticing when I've got my great big thermometer and I'm testing my thoughts and feelings. Another thing he said that I found very useful, an analogy, is that you can't tickle yourself because you're expecting it. So if you're testing yourself to see how you feel, checking to see how you feel, you're not necessarily going to get the result that you want to get anyway, or a realistic, accurate result, because you're expecting it anyway. And particularly with the way that OCD works, it presents you with the thing that you don't want, the thing that you're frightened of. So if you are doubting and then testing yourself and checking yourself, you're very likely to keep coming out with the same result, and that's going to be the thing that you don't want to feel. What makes this particular compulsion tricky is firstly the invisibility of it. So if this is a compulsion that you're doing regularly and it's keeping you, one of the compulsions that you're doing that's keeping you locked into the cycle, and you present this to a doctor, or you present your issues to a doctor, because it's not an overt outward compulsion, I think sometimes it can be you don't know that you're necessarily doing it. And so if the doctor doesn't see an obvious compulsion, it does make OCD probably harder to diagnose. I know this was the case in my particular journey because I had stopped doing what I identified as my obvious outward compulsions, but I was still very much locked in the cycle. Another difficulty with it is that I do believe a big part of it can become automatic in your mind. The same way as the mental ruminations and analysis is that you can stop the outward compulsions, but you can't necessarily just switch off the mental ruminations just like that. You can't suppress it because it will just keep bouncing back the way the original intrusive thoughts did. And I think that it's the same with this checking. It almost comes before you even notice you're doing it. And here I found that with working on more and more acceptance again, and as you work through recovery, there's less of a need to do the internal checking and less of a need to constantly be aware of how you feel, because you've worked on disputing the fact that thoughts and feelings are not as big a problem as you originally thought. So their presence, or lack of presence as the case may be, no longer is as big a problem. So you don't actually need to know if the feelings are there and not there. And again, at this point, that's when you can start using uncertainty. And you may start to feel the urge to check, and that's when you can start moving forward. You can maybe move your attention to where you want it to be a little bit easier. I do think a big part of this, though, is education. It's knowing that this is a compulsion that you may be doing, and knowing that this constant checking in with yourself, your feelings, this constant awareness is help keeping the cycle going. And it does all just come from a place of fear and a place of not accepting the presence of the thoughts and feelings. And once you've gotten to a place where you have worked on genuinely believing that their presence is much, much less of a problem, that's when you find that you might have a bit more control over the mental compulsion of checking in with yourself constantly. But thank you for listening.